Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Unofficial Seminar. Joining me is my friend and colleague, Dr. Amit Ranjan, professor at NCRT and author of the recently published book on Dara Shukoh, published by Penguin. It was released last month in New Delhi and recently also in Jaipur. The book has been received very warmly and it promises to be most exciting. Dara Shukoh is an all-time favorite of historians, politicians, and all sorts of people in between. And I'm sure Amit will walk us through those trajectories in today's conversation. Amit, welcome to the Unofficial Seminar. What inspired you to take on this
Thank you so much.
Herculean task?
Well, I always wanted to do book on Dara Shukoh. When and how, I don't know. I guess probably it's the influence of Sufi music in our lives, starting with Bollywood and then with Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. And I was deeply immersed in the music of Nusrat I've been for the past 20 years or so.
Mhm.
Um, and at some point of time, it seems to be a part of our collective memory that I gave a talk 9 years ago at CIL Mysore about Dara Shukoh, and I seem to have known the story very well. With very little preparation, I was able to do that, and that's when I resolved to do this book. And in fact, I was looking for a publisher for John Lang, and the
Mm.
publisher said, "Well, this character is too unknown for us, but you write in a rather funky style. Can you write about a Mughal?" I said, "I can write about a Mughal who could not be a Mughal." And I told them the story, and they signed the contract even without proposal. So
Mhm.
that was amazing. That was not Penguin, then it changed hands, and then it came to Penguin. And then it took longer than I expected because there's much more to the story than we generally know. So I just had to dive deep and dig here and there.
Let's talk about that. Now, Amit, I know you, and people who know you will understand that this is a kind of writing which requires a lot of experience, phenomenology. It's not about literary criticism or archival research. It's much of both, but it's something more as well. Dara Shukoh is a darling child of secularism. The Constitution of India did not feature that word for a very, very long time, but as Ashish Nandi and many, many others, including I'm sure you will also agree, there's nothing to disagree there. The Constitution itself and all the discussions that led to it were of an exceedingly secular nature. So India had no problems, as it were, of living in or with secularism without calling itself a secular republic for a very long time. Particularly after the 80s, Dara Shukoh has been a favorite, but I'm sure he was also a favorite Mughal within quotes because you say he's not entirely a Mughal or he could not be one. Why do you think this happens? You seem to claim that there isn't a clear binary between Aurangzeb, his foster brother, and Dara Shukoh as much as it is claimed. Is that a right theory, and how do you defend that theory?
Sure. So, as I understand, there are two or three parts of this question. First of all, about being the poster boy of secularism, that's a very limited understanding, and that's a binary, let's say, independent India has been operating with.
Hmm.
And on the other side of the border, as well, in Pakistan, Dara Shukoh is much vilified um, within the conservative circles. There was a playwright in the 70s, I'm forgetting his name, he was jailed by General Zia-ul Haq for writing a play about Dara Shukoh. So the binary operates at great extremes. But
Hmm.
first of all, to answer the question of secularism,
Hmm.
I would not use the word secular for Dara Shukoh.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
secular in India, as we understand it, sarvadharm sambhav,
Hmm.
equidistance, you do your thing, I do my thing, we do not disturb each other. And secularism in the European sense, in the origin of the word sense, is a distancing of politics from the church,
Hmm.
that the political power grabs power in day-to-day affairs and does not let the church interfere, does not let the church burn women at stake, and so on, which is why secularism rose in Europe, because the excesses of the church were getting too much. Here it's the opposite, isn't it? It's the state trying to introduce spiritual form of religion into polity. So Dara Shikoh wanted to bring Sufism to kingship. So that's definitely not secular in the way we know it. So he had long conversations with Baba Lal at Lahore, for example. Of course, he had many
Right.
conferences, conversations with multiple players of multiple faiths. But with Baba
Mm.
Lal, he spent the whole week to figure out whether a king could be a fakir and that a fakir could be a king. So he was doing the opposite of secularism. He was bringing spirituality to kingship, and
Right.
he's also deeply comparing religions, theology. Is deeply
Right.
comparing Upanishads, specifically Upanishads, with his Qadri order, and in general all of Sufism, which he believed was part of Islam. Whether Orthodox people of that time would not believe so, but he very much believed. And so he was going much beyond our understanding of either equidistance or the separation of political power from the church. He was comparing and saying that these all go back to some pagan root, which is Neoplatonism, which Plotinus also did in the ninth century. And so
Fascinating.
intuitively, he had that idea. So let's call him cosmopolitan and not secular. He's the original cosmopolitan medieval boy, let's say. The second broad question you've asked is the binary between Aurangzeb and Dara. Is it the poet prince and the warrior prince?
Mm.
Now,
Mm.
as I've shown my book, I haven't shown the book yet. Please
Please.
put it up, Dara Shukoh. So this is Dara Shukoh, the Fakir and the Throne of Thorns by Penguin. Yeah. So uh, as I've shown in my book, Aurangzeb was an not a pistol king but an epistle king. So he did not really win by the might of his sword or the might of his gun, but rather the might of his pun, let's say. He would write letters. He would write letters and cause them to be intercepted. That was his trick. So he
Okay.
wrote a letter from Shah Jahan to Dara Shikoh, where Shah Jahan is plotting Aurangzeb's fall, and so he can declare both the father and the eldest son apostates and against him. Or when his son, who declared himself Akbar Sani or Akbar the Second, had surrounded him with around 30,000 soldiers, and he was completely outnumbered at 5,000. He wrote a letter to his own son, Akbar II, saying that, good, you brought a Hindu king, we'll surround him at night and kill him. And he causes this letter to be intercepted by the Hindu king. The Hindu king runs
Mm.
away. And so Akbar II is surrounded, and he has to run to Deccan. And Aurangzeb followed him down to Deccan, and Jahanara said, "You will never be able to return back," and her statement was prophetic. He was never able to return back. So, and if you read the war description, uh, Dara Shikoh almost had Aurangzeb by his throat in the first battle itself. And the traitor, Khalilullah Khan, who switched sides, advised him to get off his elephant on his horse and chase Aurangzeb. And then he shouted that Dara is dead because he was not on his elephant. His army went into disarray and scurried off. Similarly, in the second battle at Ajmer, also he was betrayed like this. So you have to think Shah Jahan's army was Indian army, and um, Aurangzeb's army was Deccan army. The Deccan army cannot possibly have beaten the might of the emperor whose reign ran from Afghanistan to the Deccan. So it had to involve lots of betrayals. So Aurangzeb's strategy was more trickery than he was a valiant knight fighting his gladiator battle or anything of that sort. So this is a binary that's been created over time by both sides, Dara's side and Aurangzeb's side. And they were trained in the military arts together. It's another matter that Aurangzeb fought more battles in the Deccan. But what is silenced by history is that Aurangzeb failed the Deccan campaign twice, for which Dara had to be sent. Dara also failed in it, but nobody mentions the failures of Aurangzeb in those particular campaigns.
It's fascinating because it could be the idiosyncrasy of your storytelling, but I'm guessing it is not entirely that.
No,
Why
these are all
strike me as
documented. This is
I'm
all
I'm
archival history, of
absolutely
course.
I'm absolutely not in doubt about that. But what happens immediately 100 years later is the Battle of Plassey, and you see, in the way you were narrating that tale, it's there are parts of it that are uncannily similar to certain betrayals that happen during then. So I'm wondering if
True.
there's
So it is said that every 100 years, Hindustan changes its
right.
ruler.
So it
1657,
would be
1757,
it,
1857.
it would be very interesting for somebody to to consider whether the narration of I mean, by Orme and the other historians of the British Empire, the narration of the Battle of Plassey had anything to draw from the narration of the betrayals of Dara. But I mean, that's an aside. Of course, I do agree with you. Secularism has a very, very different definition than the definition that Indians and the Indian public discourse generally makes of it. The right word is pluralism. At least Gandhi, I suppose, Mahatma Gandhi would have preferred that word more than secularism.
So, like I
Coming to
said,
your, coming to
this.
your the focus of your book, Amit, you are very, very attached to Sufi music. I know that. You make no secret of it, and I'm sure you have invested a lot in Dara's Sufi career. Would you like to share a few aspects of that with us? Because I mean, there was Upanishad during Akbar, and Dara, to a lot of people today, even today, is known as the translator of the Upanishads, and very little else is generally recognized about him. So, but he, his poetical career. Walk us through
So
that, please.
there are a few very striking things about Dara's Sufi career. And before
Hmm.
that, Jahanara's Sufi career. Jahanara wrote biography of Khwaja Garib Nawaz, and they both had the same guru, Mullah Shah Badakhshani, who was in Kashmir. And Mullah Shah declared that Jahanara should be his successor. But there was no provision for a woman to become the successor, but Mullah Shah recorded it, made a statement about it. So pretty much Jahanara was his spiritual successor, which is why she's buried next to Nizamuddin Aulia as well. Coming to so the brother sister duo operated together in all these endeavors. He was very devoted to Mia Mir, who was the guru of Mullah Shah and Mullah Shah. And once he was very ill and was taken to Lahore, and that's he recovered as a young man. And that's when his faith started growing with the proximity of these two saints. And his contribution is immense. There are two compendiums, two encyclopedias, if you will, Safinatul Aulia, Sakinatul Aulia. Safinatul
Okay.
Aulia is the history of all saints, all Sufi saints down from Muhammad to his time, which
Mm.
includes what is now we call the Middle East, Iraq and Iran and so on. And Sakinatul Aulia is centered on India, which is his tremendous contribution to bring the focus to his Qadri Silsila, in which he was properly initiated, and bring the focus to Mia Mir and Mullah Shah and all the Indian saints. And it's a very, let's say, gorgeous as well as a memorable work because he records the birth and death dates of everyone, all the miracles, all the hagiographies. So it's a very exhaustive work. It's like um, no, two different PhDs that he did in these two books. And these are two major contributions, and also to the field of translation, because of course he translated um, whatever was available in the Sufi canon, and also translation in its original sense of carrying the dead across. So it's carried the dead across to this time. There's also a special chapter on women in Safinat, which is tremendous, which no other Sufi compendium has, including female saints who were alive during his own lifetime. Then there's Hasanat al Arifin, which is sayings of 100 saints. So 100 apostastic sayings, 100 sayings of kufr, 100 sayings of shikr, let's say, but he calls them shat, which is the allegorical, the metaphorical word of God. He says, I'm the 101st. Why are you bothering me? So these were his apologies. And his biggest work, of course, is Sadri Akbar, which is the translation of 56 Upanishads, which he found in Kashmir. And these he translated. If you go to Srinagar, there's Mullah Kun Shah's, which is Mullah Shah's mosque, which has 50 odd cells, which were for all these students of Upanishads who would translate them from Sanskrit to Persian. Who were these people? These were Banaras Pandits, whom he got into his school of translation and finished this mammoth work in merely 2 years. And this work is his grand finale, where he's trying to show with comparative notes how Sufism, especially of the Qadri order, and Upanishads are so similar. And then his big, bold claim that there is a Kitab-i Maknun, hidden book in the Quran, which
Yeah.
says that you have to be insani kamil, a kamil insan, somebody who is accomplished. And he claims to be accomplished himself, having read texts of all religions from Judaism to Islam to the Injil, the Bible, and the Hindu texts, uh, which include Bhagavad Gita, Jog, Vashisht, Upanishads, and so on. And then he declares that the hidden book, the Kitab-i Maknun, is nothing but the Upanishad. So he's trying to solve with one master stroke the Hindu-Muslim problem forever by saying that one contains the other. They are part of the same continuum, which, if you go historically, archaeologically, there may be a lot of merit in it. One doesn't know, but this claim has never been made again after him. So he's a very bold character that way. And, as a prince, um, to not just be a patron, but to be an active agent and make these claims and study things so assiduously, diligently, is he is properly a Sufi. It's a tragedy that he was a prince, so he's counted as a prince and not as a Sufi saint.
The current scenario in India, in several parts, does not perhaps allow for safe spaces for discussions or what will be termed as radical claims like the one that you just made. But I actually, on the one hand, I completely let's say understand why Aurangzeb was turned into this poster child, call it cosmopolitanism, secularism, pluralism, because there have been theories floating about in the once upon a time centrist circles, from whom we do not hear much, that during the 6th, 7th, 8th century AD, when Adi Shankaracharya and his followers were trying to reform and reclaim Hinduism through commentaries on the Upanishads, they were also responding not only to Buddhism but to Islam, and they were trying to find out middle grounds. Now, that is again a very poetical, very metaphysical claim. I'm not sure if there's any primary record, but similarly, yours is an equally outrageous claim, some might say, but also contains a lot of merit, because Dara did believe Hinduism to be a kind of extension of Islam, or Hinduism to be lurking within Islam, or vice versa. You mentioned Jahanara. What about the women in Dara's life? Was he entirely scholarly? Was he a very dry person, or did he
No,
enjoy the
no.
rasas
In fact,
of life as well?
I think
Yeah.
the historians of the Shanti Niketan school, which is Kalikaranjan, Kanungo, Jadunath, Sarkar, Bikramjit Hasrat, they all concur that Dara Shukoh was as much of an ardent lover as Shah Jahan was towards his wife. And of course, there's a lot of archival evidence of that. That when Dara was on the run, after the defeat at Samugarh near Agra, then Raja Rajrup was summoned by Nadira Begum, his wife. And it's a very fascinating story how there were wet nurses who fed Mughal children, so that the beauty of the queens is not destroyed, but more than that, so that they have Sufi blood. So these wet nurses would be from Sufi lineage and mostly Chishtis. And the milk brother, so the half brother, the son of the wet nurse, would be more loyal to the prince than his own brother. Because with his own brother, he has to fight a battle of succession. So Nadira Begum summoned Raja Rajru, and she had then just a child who was actually undocumented, because any writing about Dara Shikoh was banned by Aurangzeb. So the last two children of Dara Shikoh are not actually mentioned in the court history. So the youngest child, and so she was lactating, and she gave her milk to Raja Rajrup, that you are now my milk son, and now you have to protect my husband. He turned his back at Ajmer, greatly ironical and literary tragic, because Ajmer was the birthplace of Dara Shukoh, as well as he got defeated on the Ides of March. So there's a double literary sort of thing happening with it. So that was the kind of love Nadira Begum had for Dara Shikoh, and equally it was reciprocated. So when he was about to be captured by Malik Jivan, it is, some contemporary accounts say that Nadira Begum committed suicide because she saw the end, and some others say that she died of dysentery. Whatever the case was, she wanted to be buried next to Mia Mir in Lahore. So her coffin was sent with the most able generals who were left with Dara. And he was then, defenseless, and that's when he was captured by Malik Jivan. So it's a very tragic sort of a love story that they have. He also gifted her an album when she
Mm.
was, which is one of the rare albums of the time, which records the life of the time, and so on. And then his second wife, Rana Dil, legend has it that she was so beautiful, Aurangzeb wanted to make her his wife, and she sent a message saying, "Why does he want this?" And he sent a message saying that I love her hair. So she shaved her head and sent the hair to him. And then he said that, oh, her cheeks are very beautiful. So she slashed her face and said, as dramatically I put it in my book, that the beauty is now a beast. And so Aurangzeb backed off after that. So the people in Dara Shikoh's life were very loyal to him, and his two wives, he loved them, they loved him too. And of course, talking about other women, there's Jahanara, who was very difficult, devoted to her brother, and she spent 21 lakhs at his wedding. That was the time when it was sort of announced that he's the crown prince, and she was with him in all his Sufi yearnings and learnings, and so on.
You have also, am informed, delved into a kind of an alternative, a world of history that features Shivaji and his purported, his supposed interaction, if that's the right word, with a Mughal woman named Zeb-un-Nissa.
This
And there's a conspiracy theory that Zeb-un-Nissa was in love with Shivaji. How much do you confirm? Does your book confirm or deny this?
This is a very interesting story with Jadunath Sarkar, who's the
Mm.
authority on Aurangzeb with 6 volumes on him, recalls this. And it's also very interesting how the historians of early 20th century are literary and opinionated, which later historians do not like. So he talks about this book by Rudrangshu Mukherjee in 1857. So in the mid 19th century is the rise of the novel in all 3 languages: Bengali, Urdu, and English. People write it fervently, and Hindi as well. Um, Later, so while there's the camp of Sharat Chandra and others who wanted to paint the Mughals in a dark light, others like Rudrangshu Mukherjee who want to show Hindu-Muslim unity or love and convergence and so on. So anyway, he's exploited this little glitch in the archive that we all know Shivaji escaped from Aurangzeb's clutches in a fruit basket. We do not really know how. And Zeb-un-Nissa was young and beautiful at that point of time, used to attend the court, was a poetess, was the favorite daughter of Aurangzeb. So, in a fictional account, Rudrangshu Mukherjee shows Zeb-un-Nissa looking at Shivaji and falling in love with him. And the novel is called Anguria Binimoy, the exchange of rings. And so they exchange rings, but they know that this is ill fated, and they part ways and so on. This is the plot of the novel. So Jadunath Sarkar tells us that this novel became so popular in Bengal that it was considered history, and people started believing that Shivaji had, was in love with Zeb-un-Nissa, and also because Zeb-un-Nissa was jailed around this time. One does not know
Yeah.
why, but Jadunath Sarkar also tells in all other historical accounts, if you triangulate, there's no reference to Zeb-un-Nissa in the escape of Shivaji or any of her influence in any kind of history, either from the court or the market gossip. Nothing of that sort is pointed out to. So Jadunath Sarkar says in his very opinionated fashion, which he'd probably probably be attacked for today, is that Zeb-un-Nissa was such a sophisticated, beautiful princess who was a poet, and there was this Shivaji who was rugged and a warrior and unlettered. Do you think this match was possible? So of course he doesn't know what all kinds of matches are possible. Of course, all kinds of matches happen. And that's why we
Yeah.
have tales like Beauty and the Beast and so on. But to call Shivaji rugged and unlettered would invite a lot of wrath today. But he takes his literary liberty at that time when he's written in 1920s. Yeah,
It would incur a lot of wrath today, but Jadunath Sarkar, R.C. Mujumdar were painfully aware of and by aware I mean they were documenting it in their histories of the kind of destruction that was wreaked on Bengal in the 18th century. So on the one hand there was Kua, on the other there was Khai, the Marathas, the Borgis, as they are still referred to in Bengal. So I am not surprised
yeah,
that
that's his
Jadunath
opinion.
Sarkar did not have a high opinion of Shivaji's aesthetic appearance. But since you have mentioned Jadunath Sarkar a few times, Amit, let me ask you this somewhat provocatively, if I may. You have been writing for some years now. John Lang and Dara Shukoh both are, I think, more than writings in history. Whether you are a historian, who is a historian, I'm not. I'm not going into that very facile debate. But surely you've been handling the papers quite a lot. And what's your view on the likes of Jadunath Sarkar? You haven't mentioned any of the contemporary voices we hear, and I
Well,
will not mention
my
them.
bulk
Yeah,
of my reading is from the 19th century.
yeah.
Um, Mostly translations of all these Persian texts and uh, Indologists at that point of time.
Mm,
So, problem these days is the matter of authenticity. The moment you hear Indologists, British, Germans,
mm,
you immediately want to cast them aside, but they are the ones who did all the hard work. And
precisely.
talking of Jadunath Sarkar, 6 volumes, and on Aurangzeb, and not just that, his writings are tremendous about Bihar, about Bengal, about Odisha, and all of it is done through primarily primary archival material. So he's the one who studied all the Jaipur records, all the letters that were exchanged between the Jaipur court and Aurangzeb, and between all sorts of courts and all the museums that had all these papers in Persian, most of which now are just lying there because there are a few people who can understand the Mughal Persian. So all that painstaking work in one lifetime is tremendous. So you may call him revisionist, you may call him whatever for his opinions, but the primary groundwork has been laid by him, and that we have to give it to him, definitely. At least in the case of Aurangzeb. In the case of Dara Shukoh, of course, I've had to refer to lots and lots of other sources. But Aurangzeb was kind of I wanted to keep him on the periphery, but somehow he refuses to be that. Like he's reduced Dara to a footnote of history of one war, but within
Mm,
Dara's own scheme, I could not reduce him to a footnote because he's a very Machiavellian character who's very paranoid. And
mm,
you think, like historians generally tend to say that, oh, it's a time honored thing. They
mm,
use the phrase time honored, like in Audrey Tushki's book, that every generation there was bloodthirst and battle, but you do not blame Shah Jahan and Jahangir for it, and so on. And so, what if he killed his 3 brothers?
mm,
All right, but what about his 4 sons? He went after his sons, the ones who were to inherit the kingdom. And he declared that the dominion is barren. He told his sons that you will have to fight it out. While Shah Jahan was trying to solve the problem by giving it to Dara Shikoh. But more than all of this, the real trouble, I think, or where it becomes psychologically very fascinating for me, is the matter of Zeb-un-Nissa, his favorite daughter, who was a Sufi poet. What did she do? We do not really know what she did. There are accounts of her supporting Akbar II, this
mm,
her brother, but how would she have supported him really, except for encouraging words, or maybe something, maybe some secrets that should have. But um, it is described that Aurangzeb loved her very much, so his paranoia grew so much that he threw his favorite daughter into the prison,
mm, mm,
and she rotted there for 20 years. Like he gave opium water to all his prisoners in Gwalior prison. That's what he did to his daughter as well. And that he was a very lonely, wretched man who had lost all his relatives. And Jahanara had to make great efforts to patch
mm.
up, get cousins married again to reform the family when he became quite old. And anyway, he was in Deccan, he was not in Delhi. So the affairs of Delhi had to be handled by Jahanara.
Amit, I'm afraid, I mean, this conversation should go on ideally, but I'm afraid we've come to the end of time, our stipulated time. I have one last question for you. Um, uh, how do you think that we should communicate Mughal history to future India today? History is not linear. History has been, no matter what one says, we can see that it has been refashioned by regimes in the 1970s, 80s, for good or bad reason. I will not get into that, but clearly it has been creatively represented in many ways. You are also a very creative person, but you have also told me in off the record how much liberty has been taken with Mughal history. So, what do you think as a thinker of history should we do about Mughal history today in India?
Mughal history is like any other period of history. It's
Hmm.
an important period because it's closer to us. And there's the British
Hmm.
history before this, and just before that is the Mughal history. It's only the proximity in time and the bearing it has upon us. Otherwise, Muslims were rulers since Gauri,
Hmm.
1192.
Hmm.
But one doesn't really, it's Mughals have become metaphorical. There's 1200 to 1526, which is 325 years. That's never seen as a unity, but 300 years of Mughal are seen as some kind of a metaphor.
Muslim, yeah, Muslim rule.
And it's a very interesting phase because it's the rise of Sikhism um, as a militant religion from a Sufi force, largely because of Jahangir, who hated the Sufis because of his own psychological problems. So it's a very good psychological study. Akbar was such a great ruler. He tried so many things. There's Dara Shukoh, Aurangzeb with his long career. So it does have tremendous. And after that, Nadir Shah and Bahadur Shah Zafar and so on. It's a very important part of history, and it's um, closer in proximity, and Marathas going north, and so on. And that's why it seems like, but it should be treated like any other period of history, and people are welcome to study the Gupta Empire, the age of Buddha, Ashoka, whatever fascinates them. And we've been blessed in India that we've had a good education system where we've been taught everything, unlike our neighbor where large parts of history have been obliterated. So they do not have that kind of perspective. So, and also one has to understand that kingship is kingship, and it's very different from modern democracy. So you cannot pick up one and start bashing them. You have to look at it in a larger context. And the world, of course, the forces of history moved on to change the entire world from monarchy to democracy, as the world is churning right now to move to some other form of better governance. So we are as human beings, we're always on the lookout for better forms of governance. Of course, all feudal systems were alike, and in fact, the number of allies of Aurangzeb
Hmm.
from the Hindu side, all the Rajputs of Rajasthan were with Aurangzeb. Raja Jai Singh was a loyal servant of Shah Jahan, but he betrayed him to be with Aurangzeb. So to try to create this binary of Dara with Hindus and Aurangzeb with Muslims does
Hmm.
not hold down at all. It's all strategic feudal politics of its own time. And that's how it should be studied. But the problem is that we've lost the culture of deep reading and critical understanding and contextual understanding. We pick up tidbits and get emotional about it,
Yeah.
which is a reflection of our own ethos, as Milan Kundera would say.
Good old Milan Kundera, good old Amit. Amit, today's episode, I'm afraid, was slightly devoid of your, favorite figures of speech and rhetoric and wit and
And
everything
Leonard
else.
Cohen. But
And Leonard Cohen,
but I'll
but
tell you that
yeah,
just the last thing, that every chapter
okay.
begins with the Leonard Cohen song. So there is flavor there in the book.
Why am I not surprised? Amit, all the very best. You are most welcome to hold the book up once again and make sure it's in focus this time. Uh,
Somehow it
Excellent.
loses focus, but yeah,
Yeah, but
we'll see. This is Dara Shukoh.
you are in focus, which is more important. Amit, thank you for writing this book. All the very best to this. All the very best to Dara Shiko.
Thank you so much,
And
Arup. It's always lovely talking to you.
dear audience, please like, share, and subscribe to the unofficial seminar. And we hope to have Amit back shortly on the unofficial seminar. Amit, thank you for giving me your time. Once
Thank
again,
you.
all the very best and take care.
Thank
Ladies
you.
and gentlemen,